I sell plasma to live a normal life while I win research awards and money for the university.
Graduate workers at U of M kicked off a strike.
It comes after months of negotiations with the school and no agreement.
We've been bargaining with the University of Michigan since November. Our demands are around a living wage for all graduate workers, for childcare affordability, for healthcare affordability.
The cost of living is absolutely out of control. In my department, classical studies, we did a survey in September of last year, and I think about 70% of us took on at least one job outside of our teaching load so that we would be able to literally just afford our rent and afford groceries. I buy frozen groceries for most of the time. I haven't seen a fresh vegetable in months because I can't afford it.
I'm personally paying 40% of my monthly income for the rent. All the international students are paying hundreds of international student fees to the university. However, it's not clear where this money is used for. So we're also asking for establishing an international student emergency fund.
We're here today because we deserve a living wage.
The University of Michigan's a public university. We have over a $17 billion endowment. It's one of the largest endowments in the world, let alone public university endowments. There's just no reason that graduate workers shouldn't be able to afford to pay rent in this city or to buy groceries.
In general, the regents and the president of the university care more about the reputation of the school than actually caring for its workers.
The university has preemptively withheld wages for our graduate workers who are already experiencing a cost of living crisis. And many of us will now be wondering how to afford our May rent payments.
Instead of taking us seriously at the bargaining table, they're suing us in court and trying to prevent us from striking. We make the university $200 million a year, and we don't get paid a living wage. It's absolutely ridiculous.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. Tonight, we are going to be discussing an issue that does not get the attention that it deserves, because when we talk about the exploitation of workers, we often think about workers in the fast food industry, work at McDonald's, who make $8 or $9 an hour. We think about workers at Amazon in those warehouses who work under terrible working conditions. We think about blue-collar workers in factories who are underpaid and have minimal benefits. When we think about exploited workers, we think about agricultural workers, often immigrants who work out in hot fields making sub-minimum wages. That's often how we regard the concept of exploited workers. But very rarely, when we talk about worker exploitation, are we thinking about what is happening on major college campuses all across this country. And yet, worker exploitation is not just affecting blue-collar workers and people who work with their hands. Worker exploitation also impacts teachers, researchers, and white-collar workers in some of the most prestigious academic institutions in America. When we talk about graduate students, for example, we often say, well, these are young people who are doing well. They're getting their master's degree, they're getting their PhDs, and that's true. But what we don't recognize is the truth that many of these graduate students are also working long and difficult hours on their campuses and are in many ways propping up their entire academic institutions. The reality is that these graduate student workers are fighting for the same things as blue-collar workers are fighting for, and that is fair wages, decent benefits, safe working conditions, and decent work schedules. And the good news is, what we have been seeing in recent years, is that all across this country, from coast to coast, these workers are organizing unions and they are winning their battles. And this evening, we're going to hear about some of these struggles at some of the largest campuses in America. We're going to learn about what precipitated these struggles and what these graduate students have accomplished. And let me just tell you that in the last year alone, just in the last year, graduate students graduate student workers have gone on strike at Harvard, Temple, the University of California, Fordham, Rutgers, Columbia, New York University, the University of Illinois at Chicago, and at the University of Michigan, where that strike persists as of today. And let me also give you just one example of what these graduate student workers are up against. Just one example. At MIT, one of the great academic institutions in our country, that school, MIT, has an endowment of $27 billion. And yet graduate student workers on that campus spend on average 55% of their financial stipend on housing. 55% of what they earn simply goes to put a roof over their heads. In other words, they are struggling to survive in a high-cost city like Boston. In addition to the strikes that we have seen on campuses in the last year, we have also seen graduate student workers form unions at MIT, at Johns Hopkins, Northwestern, Georgetown, Duke, Emory, the University of Chicago, New Mexico State University, Yale, George Washington University, the University of New Mexico, the University of Minnesota, Boston University, and many others. So what we're seeing now is an incredible expansion of union organizing among graduate student workers on campuses from coast to coast. So what we are seeing is that these tens of thousands of graduate student workers are standing up and they are fighting for economic justice. And what is very, very inspiring to me is that on many of these campuses, their actions are being supported by the students who go to these schools. They're being supported by adjunct professors, and sometimes they're being supported by tenured professors. Last week, Stanford University graduate students filed for an NLRB election, which will cover 5,700 student graduate workers, and it's the largest NLRB petition that has been filed in the year 2023. That is a big deal. 5,700 people filing for a petition. Northeastern University is waiting on an election date that will see 1,700 graduate student workers vote to form their union. At Rutgers University, 9,000 workers used the power of solidarity and went on strike for each other. From full-time faculty to adjunct professors and lecturers, administrators and graduate student workers, they achieved huge gains coming together, including raises, big raises, and more favorable time off. Rutgers workers begin voting on that contract tomorrow. We'll see what happens. At the University of California, at the largest university system in our country, tens of thousands of workers won 50% gains in base pay, dependent health care, and increased child care stipends for workers who are parents. In other words, at a time when more and more workers all across this country are standing up and fighting back for decent wages and benefits, graduate student workers have been at the forefront of that struggle. So tonight, I am very delighted that we have with us union leaders from 4 major American universities who are going to tell us why they organized, why they went out on strike, and what they gained from their efforts. So it is a real honor to have with us some real American heroes and heroines. And we're going to begin with Nick Christo. Nick is the president of the University of Illinois, Chicago Graduate Student Union, and which has represents some 1,500 graduate student workers. Nick, thanks very much for being with us. tell us about the issues that you were confronting, why you guys formed the union, why you went on strike, and what the results of all that were.
Thank you for having me. My name is Nick. I'm the outgoing co-president of University of Illinois Chicago Graduate Employees Organization. We represent roughly 1,600 teaching and graduate assistants who mostly work and live in the city of Chicago, very close to downtown. So our union work really never ends. Last year, we spent roughly 9 days out in a cold Chicago winter on strike fighting for our fair contract. And this year, we spent our time enforcing our contract and educating both our members and the university of the new rights won under that contract. That contract featured some really big wins. In the first year, we won a raise of roughly 9.6% to combat the rising cost of just living in a huge city and the rising cost of inflation across the nation. And this, across our 3-year contract, we won about a raise of roughly 17%. We won lump sum payments for those who worked during our contract bargaining year, making sure that everyone saw the immediate benefits of our raise and was able to afford the rising costs as they experienced them the entire year. Our contract had fee freezes and partial waivers to the fees that university charges us just to work at the university. And most importantly, we had a 50% waiver to the fee exclusive to international students who are extremely limited in the amount of work and type of work that they're able to do while living in the US. For parents, we tripled the amount of parental leave. Being a parent and being a graduate student is a tough burden. And we expanded the dependent coverage for people who have existing children on campus healthcare. Maybe our biggest win was that we won supportive measures and protections for graduate employees who experience sexual harassment or discrimination from their supervisors in their workplace, lab, or classroom. We have language granting survivors more autonomy over the reporting process of their experienced harassment. Now that our contract is settled, we're going to spend the next couple years organizing the research assistants on our campus who were recently barred from unionizing. These RAs have no protections against discrimination, harassment, or having their employee contracts terminated unexpectedly. They deserve a contract that protects them, and we're going to make sure that they get it. That's what our union's been up to, and that's what we're going to continue the fight to do.
Nick, thanks very much. Our next panelist is Ember McCoy, who is the Vice President of the Graduate Employees Organization at the University of Michigan and a third-year PhD candidate in the School for Environment and Sustainability. Ember, thanks very much for being with us.
Thanks for having us. My name's Ember. I'm calling in from Ann Arbor, Michigan, where graduate workers have been on strike since March 29th. This is the longest strike in our union's 50-year history. We've now surpassed the month-long strike that formed our union in 1974. And our semester ended this past week, so we're currently in a grade strike where graduate workers are withholding their grades, and university admin seems to be prioritizing submitting phony grades and cheapening the quality of education here at the university instead of negotiating with us in good faith. They've attempted to use the courts to force us back to work. They've put graduate workers in handcuffs, and they've withheld our paychecks, but we know our worth, and we're continuing to fight for a fair contract. Our platform is simple. Our campaign is centered around affordability and dignity for all graduate workers. The gap between our salaries and the cost of living in Ann Arbor has tripled since our last negotiations in 2020, and that gap is now over $14,000. The university's own on-campus graduate housing is unaffordable by HUD standards, and one of the university's regions actually is one of the biggest landlords in our city. And so we're in an affordability crisis of the university's own making, where graduate workers who do a significant amount of teaching on campus are unable to afford rent, to afford groceries and their basic needs, let alone emergency expenses. And this is all happening while we're at this public university that sits on a $17 billion endowment. And our campaign is really grounded in solidarity and care for our most vulnerable workers. So we're fighting for a living wage, but also for extra support for those who need it, like parents, international workers, disabled students, for expanded harassment protections and better gender affirming care, and for a community-based police alternative. And to me, we're out here fighting for the bare minimum for basic human rights. And the university is acting like we're being absurd. These administrators who make hundreds of $1,000s a year are trying to paint or ask for a modest living wage and adequate health care for their workers as these big, extravagant demands. But we know this isn't the case, and we're going to continue fighting for what we deserve. We also know that this isn't just about us, that it's about our students whose learning conditions are our working conditions. It's about the labor movement and graduate workers across the country, like those here today. And yeah, folks listening can support by donating to our strike hardship fund that's going directly to workers who currently have had their paycheck withheld. That's givebutter.com/geostrikefund. But it's an honor to be here and to be in this struggle with you all.
Amber, thanks very much. Our next panelist, and I apologize if I mispronounce her last name, is Sophie Kopeters, who is a graduate student at MIT and a founding member of the MIT Graduate Student Union. Sophie, thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me, Senator Sanders, and you said my last name absolutely correctly, so thank you for that too. So the MIT Graduate Student Union, UE Local 256, represents 5,000 graduate student workers at MIT, including research assistants, teaching assistants, and instructor Gs. We perform the majority of the research and teaching work that makes MIT run. And a little over a year ago, after 4+ years of organizing our union campaign, we won our union election with a margin of 2-1. This landslide election win came on the heels of a months-long anti-union campaign from MIT, where we were told that unionization would fail and that unionizing wouldn't solve the issues that we were organizing around. But what we've learned throughout our fight is that everything that the boss has told us is impossible is possible through our collective action and unity as workers. For a little context, and Senator Sanders actually mentioned these numbers, MIT is an employer sitting on a $27 billion endowment. Meanwhile, we graduate workers at MIT are paying an average of 55% of our stipends in rent, leaving the majority of us heavily rent burdened. I myself spent the last 2 winters living in an apartment with no heat because I couldn't afford to move into better housing. And with record inflation and rent hikes in the last couple of years, our budgets have only gotten tighter. On top of the immense financial stress our graduate workers face, we also face a working environment with rampant harassment, discrimination, and bullying. Faculty at MIT are 3 times more likely than the national average to harass graduate workers. And graduate workers are frequently bullied into overwork. 40% of our graduate workers are international, and so we're also fighting for equal opportunities and for relief for burdensome fees that international workers are charged by MIT. Last September, when we began bargaining with MIT for our first contract, so many things that MIT told us were impossible have begun to become possible at the bargaining table now that we're organized and we're continuing to ramp pressure up on MIT. In the last 8 months, we've won major improvements to our workplace, namely enforceable laboratory health and safety policies that go beyond OSHA, clear job definitions, workload protections, and the first IP rights of any grad union contract in the US. This week, we're coming off of a huge all-day picket this past May Day, International Workers' Day. And tomorrow, we're entering our final day of negotiations with MIT after months of organizing. We are still currently fighting for a union shop, fair wages, and real recourse for harassment, discrimination, and bullying. Beyond these big changes to our living and working conditions that we're fighting for, I think what excites us most is how our union fight and our fight for our first contract fits within the broader resurgence of the labor movement across the country. As Senator Sanders mentioned, grad workers are unionizing rapidly at Dartmouth, Yale, BU, Johns Hopkins, University of Minnesota. The list really goes on. And this resurgence of the labor movement also goes far beyond graduate workers. Union popularity is at its highest today since 1965. Workers across many industries are taking on their bosses and winning enormous improvements through union fights. We've seen major wins recently at UC with the graduate workers, teachers and facility workers in LA, nurses in New York City and Minnesota, many workers at Rutgers, and unions like the Writers Guild and University of Michigan are on strike right now. And we're on the eve of one of the largest labor battles in the last couple of decades between UPS and the Teamsters, which represent 350,000 UPS workers. I think this resurgence in the labor movement indicates that we workers at MIT and workers across the US are really disillusioned after the COVID-19 pandemic, after uprisings against racist police brutality in the summer of 2020. And there's a rising consciousness around the need for solidarity amongst working people. And what we've learned here at MIT through our union fight and what workers are realizing across the country is that the change that our bosses tell us isn't possible really is possible when we workers unite and fight for one another. Thanks.
Sylvie, thank you very much. Our last panelist, and I hope I don't mispronounce his last name, is Rafael Jaime, president of the, pardon me?
Jaime, yeah, that's correct.
Okay, who is president of the UAW Local 2865. He is a PhD graduate student at UCLA studying English. UAW 2865 represents all 36,000 academic student employees, teaching assistants, graduate student researchers, graduate student instructors, tutors, and readers across the University of California system. Rafael, thanks so much for being with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on. And yes, like many of the other issues that others have mentioned, these are the same issues that impact workers at the University of California. And this is why last fall, workers from my local, alongside workers from UAW 5810, which is a union of postdocs in academic research at the University of California, went on a multi-unit coordinated strike across all 11 campuses of the University of California. This was a strike involving 48,000 academic workers. And this fight really was about access to opportunity at the University of California. Over the years, we've seen many of our universities become further and further out of reach, out of the working class. And this is why so many of us are unionizing, because when wages don't keep up with the cost of inflation, when we face rampant bullying and abuse in the workplace, our universities are going to become less and less diverse. They will not reflect the diversity that exists in our states. And so all of these unionization fights, whether we're at MIT, Michigan, University of Illinois, University of California, these really are fights about access to the university, to the opportunities that universities offer. And if we want to continue, if we want to take back our universities and to become, for them to be truly a beacon of opportunity, universities that provide, that give out opportunity to the working people, then we need to unionize on a massive scale. Because that's the only way that we're actually going to make these into truly public institutions. At the University of California, the biggest issues driving our unionization efforts and our strike was the cost of living. In all the campuses where we live, graduate workers end up paying more than 50% of our salaries towards rent, often directly back to the university itself. The university knows exactly how much money we make, and then they take half of it back in rent. And the other issue that was really motivating workers is the rampant pervasive bullying that we see in the workplace and sexual harassment and discrimination. There have been studies out there that have shown that the rate of sexual harassment and discrimination in academia is second only to the military. And so, just let that sink in. And so, this is just drives so many workers out of academia and deprives them of the opportunity that they deserve. And then the other issue that was so important to us was opportunity for parents and caregivers. Because it is almost impossible to be a parent and pursue higher education. And so when we went on strike, what we ended up winning was wage increases of 55 to 80%. We were able to also win industry standard setting new protections against bullying in the workplace. And we also won 8 weeks of parental leave. for either of the parents. And so these are really important issues that, again, are going to allow for the university to be a much more equitable, accessible, and democratic workplace. And this is what the fight has always been about. And right now we're focusing on implementing the contract and holding university accountable to that contract, but also doing political work to expand the right to strike to all other public sector employees, and specifically the right to go on solidarity strike, because as we've seen at the university, Rutgers University, that kind of action, solidarity strike, was so essential for them to win actually one of the best, if not the best, contract out there for graduate student workers. And it was truly inspiring, and we're hoping that we can continue to expand that kind of action across the entire country.
Raphael, thanks very much. Let me start off the discussion. We've got some questions that people online have sent in. I'm going to get to them in a second. But let me start off with this. I think some people who may be watching this are saying, I understand that McDonald's workers are exploited. I understand that factory workers are exploited. Starbucks workers are underpaid. Graduate students, give me a break. So I want you to tell the listeners, what the working conditions, what life is like for graduate student workers on your campuses. Who wants to jump in on that? I know you touched on some of those issues, but who wants to jump in? You're a graduate student. What's the graduate student worker? What's the problem?
I can start.
Sophie, you want to jump in?
Yeah. So at MIT, our graduate student workers are primarily research assistants or teaching assistants. And that means that we're producing the large majority of the teaching value and the teaching work, and then also the research value for MIT as an institution. The day-to-day for a graduate worker looks like long hours in the lab, long hours producing research output, and long hours teaching all of the undergraduates who come to MIT expecting a world-class education. And the graduate workers here are the teaching assistants that provide that education to the undergrads here.
And have those graduate student workers been adequately paid for what they do?
No, absolutely not. So as I mentioned, we pay 55% of our stipends on average back to rent. We live in the second most expensive city in the US, Boston, and we're not paid enough to be able to live here and to afford living close to the university.
Okay. Who else wants to jump in? Yeah, Amber.
Yeah, I can add too that, just like the Amazons and the McDonald's of the world, our universities are making tons of money off the back of our low paid labor. The University of Michigan makes over $200 million off of graduate student labor a year. We work long hours, we're graduate student instructors, and so we do a large portion of the teaching on campus. We're the second largest body of instructors after tenure track faculty who get paid a lot more money than us. And we do all that work on top of doing research, on top of doing service for the university, of which we do not get paid. And so, our wages, which again are not the living wage in our city, have to make ends meet for our full lives, our full employments. And we work really long hours, for a huge profit for the university that we're not really seeing back for ourselves.
What kind of benefits have healthcare, et cetera, have graduate student workers received at the University of Michigan, for example?
Yeah, we have a lot of things that we're fighting for in terms of mental health copay caps and physical therapy copay caps, some of which we've won. And part of that is to, help alleviate the costs of being a graduate worker on campus. One of the big things that we're fighting for is gender affirming care for our trans workers. And a lot of that right now is things that we have on paper, but that there aren't services for in our city. So we're seeking to get more protections and more healthcare accessibility, for the things we've won in the past as well.
Okay, anybody else want to jump in on working conditions, benefits?
Sure.
Are you paid for the number of hours that you actually work? I've heard that as a complaint. I was at the University of Illinois in Chicago, and what I heard people say, well, we get paid but 20 hours, we actually work 30 hours. Is that a common problem? Who wants to jump in on that one?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, absolutely. The university always tries to draw this arbitrary distinction between what is our work as students and what is our work as workers at the university. And, the line is extremely blurry, and the university takes advantage of that. And so we have many graduate students who end up, work 60 hours a week, but only get paid for 20 hours a week. And so at the University of California, what this looked like is, the average graduate student worker was making something like $24,000 a year in one of the most expensive rental markets in the country, Los Angeles, California. And so, what ends up happening is I have plenty of coworkers who have had to live out of their car because they couldn't afford.
Is that really true?
Yes, this is something that happens. That does happen at the university. That was something that happened to a number of people, but also, people are also just driven out of academia because they can't afford to do it anymore. I've had multiple coworkers who, after becoming parents, could no longer stay at the university and had to leave academia because it was just not affordable, didn't have the kind of support that they needed. And so, that's two really bright minds who ended up having to leave my program because they just couldn't make it anymore.
So what I'm hearing from several of you is, Sophie talked about living in an apartment without heat. Raphael talks about, people living in their cars. It's hard to believe in America that we have graduate students living under those conditions. Anyone want to, and Raphael just mentioned people earning not enough money to even stay in the program and giving up on graduate school. Anyone want to elaborate on that? Is that true all over the country, do we think? Who wants to say a word on that? Nick, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Like, the whole thing with graduate workers is like, really you're just living to make ends meet. Many Americans do this. It's not a right way to live. Really, every month you're just hoping that you have enough to cover your bills and limit the amount of debt that you take on. And it's not an easy way to live. It's hard being a student already. It's hard taking care of and caring for your students while just trying to live a decent life. It's unreasonable. It's not right, especially when you go to schools where administrators are getting paid hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they're not the ones who are seeing students cry in class. It's, we're doing the work and we know what our worth is, and we're not seeing it.
All right, several of you have mentioned the degree to which graduate student workers are doing the research, doing the teaching. How is it fair to say that you are the kind of the backbone of the universities in which you are working? Is that fair to say, or what? Who wants to jump in on that one?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fair to say. I mean, we as graduate workers produce the majority of the value for the institution, right? We do the majority of the research work. We're the ones who are in the labs for the majority of the time, and same with teaching. We're supporting all of the students who need teaching resources that professors aren't able to give, and that's the role of teaching assistants there. And I think that's why we're seeing administrations react so strongly to graduate student unionizations, because they understand how critical their graduate worker population is to the value that the institute produces. Without their graduate workers, they can't produce the majority of the research and teaching that they usually do.
I am not an expert on academia, but I am assuming that you guys spend a lot of time in personal contact with students, maybe more than other type of teachers. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I mean, at the University of Michigan, like Nick and Sophie have said, graduate students are the ones doing the discussion sections, doing the lab sections, that are having the most face-to-face small group interactions with undergraduate students. We're the ones who they come to when they're overwhelmed, when they're having mental health problems, when they need letters of recommendations. We're the ones who are building these like personal, meaningful relationships with our students, which is why we say that, our working conditions are their learning conditions, right? Like when we live lives where we are able to afford rent, are able to afford groceries, are getting adequate health care, we can do a better job in the classroom caring for our students, which is, I think, goes back to what you said, is the real backbone of these universities. They see our value. There's officers in our union who have been, during our strike, got awards talking about how valuable their teaching was at the same time that, we're not being paid a living wage. And so there's this real hypocrisy, I think, going on that these graduate student labor strikes are highlighting.
Let me ask you this question, and all of you come from, some of the best colleges and universities in America. What kind of support are you getting on campus for your organizing efforts and when you have gone out on strike? You're getting support, people angry at you? What are you hearing from people in the community?
Happy to take this one. During our strike, we had an immense amount of support from our community, from faculty as well as students. On the picket line, we had workers from so many other unions, from dock workers, teachers, hotel workers, construction workers, all coming to the picket line to support us. It was really exciting. Also, just so many students joining the picket lines with us. And yeah, I think it's because people do see what's happening to our universities and understand that if we want to ensure that our universities continue to be the public serving institutions, that we need these kind of actions. And so, yeah, it was so exciting to see so many other unions out there supporting us.
It sounds like you're teaching an extra course on workers' rights and economics in your struggle. What do you, other folks want to jump in terms of what kind of support you are getting or not getting in your communities?
Yeah, similar to Raphael, we've had a ton of support on our picket lines throughout the last month. We've had nurses on our picket line, lecturers, undergraduate students, teachers, Teamsters, pretty much any labor support that you can imagine. We did a couple pickets at construction sites on campus where the trades workers didn't cross our picket lines and joined us out there. And we've had support from labor movement across the country. We had the UC sent us pizza one day, and we've gotten donations from different grad workers. So I think the solidarity really expands, beyond campus in the state and across the country. And to your point, one of our undergraduate allies who's been on the picket line said that he's learned more on the picket lines last month than he's learned in the classroom, and that it was some of the most valuable education that he's had. And so I think it's a real lesson in a lot of different things out on these picket lines that shows some important solidarity.
I often say I graduated from the University of Chicago, which is a very good school, but I learned more off campus in my 4 years at the University of Chicago than I did in my classrooms. Anyone else want to talk about community support or lack of support? Or yeah, Nick.
I would like to first shout out SEIU 73, who was a great supporter on our picket lines when we went on strike, along with our United Faculty Union, who went on strike last winter. I remember some of the first days before our strike last year when I, explained to students that I want to be in the classroom. I don't want to be on strike. And I had a student stand up and give like a speech in my classroom about how we should be supportive of teaching assistants and graduate workers on campus, and that it isn't right that we're, not earning enough money to afford living in our city. When faculty went on strike last winter, I had one of my students coming up to me before and after class saying, "Hey, there's a faculty rally going on. You should come out to it." And I was like, "Well, yeah, I know." The students were some of our biggest supporters, and it was like some of the biggest things that said, yeah, the stuff we're doing is really important and people care, especially the people that we're serving on campus. So support from students helped keep our fire and our strike going.
Anyone want to add to that? Okay, we have a number of questions that came in from online. And let me just throw out a few of them to you. One question is, what advice would you give to workers who want to organize their workplace but don't know where to start. In other words, you know, if you think about union organizing, one does not usually think of college campuses, right? You guys did it, all right? How did that happen? How did you figure out, you know, forming a union is not the easiest thing in the world. How did you do it? Some of you did it independently. Some of you did it with national unions. Talk about how you learned to take the first steps here.
I mean, at the University of Michigan, we've been a union for a long time, but we're under right to work conditions, and so every year we have to crawl back up in membership. And I think for those wanting to organize their workplace, you know, it really starts very simple. You know, you should talk to your coworkers about their living and working conditions. What do you love about your job? What do you dislike about it? What do you wish you had? You know, it just really starting with conversations. And you know, we map our workplaces, so who's who, when do they work, who do they work with, you know, what unit do they work in, and identifying, you know, organic leaders. So who are the coworkers that everyone knows, that everyone talks to, that everyone likes, that have a lot of influence in their workplace. But organizing is really just talking to each other about your working conditions and banding as a collective to get what you deserve. We have an amazing organizing committee and organizing co-chairs that really do invaluable work, and we wouldn't be here without them. But it starts with simple conversations.
Well, I think you're probably making it out to be easier than it really is. Organizing and going out on strike ain't so easy. Who else wants to, you know, what are some of the impediments? You know, this stuff is not easy. Organizing people is not easy. Getting people to stand together and go out on strike, risk losing their paychecks, getting fired, etc. None of that stuff is easy. So who wants to talk a little bit more about the steps that you had to overcome and some of the problems that you had to deal with? Who wants to address that? Sophie?
I'm happy to jump in here, since we unionized very recently, a little over a year ago. And I want to echo what Ember said. I really think to start organizing and to keep a union organized, it's really about talking to your coworkers. And when we're thinking about how do we take a group of workers who, I think for a lot of us, right, our bosses and the workplace make us feel really isolated, make us feel overwhelmed by the issues we're dealing with. And I think the first step of talking to your coworkers is beginning to realize that all of us are dealing with the same issues, right? These aren't isolated problems. We're collectively dealing with the same issues that are implemented and carried out by our bosses. And so talking to coworkers on a broad scale builds that unity, in that we're united in the same struggles, and also allows workers to start realizing that if we come together to address these collective struggles, we have some power against our employer, because the feeling of isolation is what keeps us sort of in line with what our employer wants us to be doing, right? If they have successfully convinced us that, you know, only you are having a problem because you have no dental insurance, then they don't have to worry about you complaining about it or being able to do anything about it. But once you realize that actually everybody really wants dental insurance, then the boss has a problem on their hands, right? And that's when you can actually do something about your working and living conditions.
I'm looking at a question that came in from Jess, and she writes, I think it's a question that a lot of people would ask, and that is, what value does a union bring? I am not part of a union and don't know the benefits. I think I would suspect millions of people would ask the same question. I'm not against the union, I'm not for the union. Why should I join the union? What does it do for me? Who wants to respond to that? Nick?
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk. So I would say it's really easy to grow a little complacent about like the benefits of a union. You have one, they fight for a contract, you win your contract, it's settled. What do we need a union for when you're not fighting for a contract? And it's the protections that the contract guarantees. It's really easy to forget that, like, without these things written and signed by the university and the union, that we have no rights in a lot of ways. And, you know, if your if your PI loses funding, you're out of a job for research assistants at University of Illinois Chicago, where as a TA and GA, if you sign a offer letter, you're guaranteed funding. Like things like this, the university would be really happy for us to pay 100% in fees rather than having some fee waivers. They would love that for them, while it would really suffer for us. I think it's really easy to forget that like once you have a union, like you are standing on the whole history of wins that like were hard fought for. And it's really these things like, you know, you might be somewhat privileged in that like maybe you came from a family of money, you have no debt and things like this, but there's someone who has several kids, they're trying to make it through grad school, and the union fights for everyone in the union, especially the people who like experience the most troubles, like parents, international students. We're fighting for everyone.
Okay. I would imagine, Nick, and some of you have talked about having kids and being a graduate student worker. That must be, I'm hearing from you guys that that's a pretty tough existence. Is that correct? Okay. Anyone want to add to what Nick said about the value of being in a union? Raphael, did you want to jump in on that?
I mean, yeah, I think the difference is, you know, of having a union. It's the difference between fighting for something on your own and fighting for something collectively. And, you know, when the boss that you're confronting is a multi-billion-dollar institution with all the resources they can throw at any fight, the only way that you have power is by taking collective action together, by pooling resources and acting together is the only way that you can win. So if we want to see, you know, improving our work, if we want to improve our working conditions, if we want to have higher pay, if we want to have greater protections in the workplace, then we need to band together and fight for them together. And that is what having a union is workers acting together to have greater control over their working conditions. And so, yeah, I think that is the union difference.
Okay. Anybody else? Emma, Sophie, want to jump in on that? Value of a union?
The way we think about it, right, is if you're a worker, right, imagine going to your boss and asking, hey, can I have better dental care, right? Or can I have a huge cost of living adjustment raise, right? Or can I, have better workplace harassment protection, right? Doing that as an individual, as Raphael said, is, I think for most workers, it wouldn't be successful, right, to go ask for these things on your own as an individual worker. And so the union is the way to collectively, get these things that workers deserve, but are able to fight that together. We often use a picture of all these little fishes banding together to make a big fish to, fight the boss. But I think that's exactly what it is. It's kind of cheesy, but it's being able to fight as a collective, for what everyone deserves and also what the most vulnerable people in your workplace deserve as well, and have a lever to do that.
Anybody else want to jump in on that? Okay. Mike writes in and asks, what can the average person do to support workers on strike? All right, you're out on strike. Somebody is not on campus. What can the average person do?
I mean, I think in terms of any strike, the most basic thing is to not cross a picket line if you see them. So whether you're rolling up to your Starbucks or to your classroom and you see workers out on strike, don't go inside, but join their picket lines. Ask workers why they're on strike, what they're fighting for, and how you can help. As I mentioned earlier, most people on strike have strike funds. So donate to strike funds if you're able, follow them on social media. We often do asks around letter writing and things like that. And I think another big thing is supporting politicians who are supportive of unions. Michigan just became the first state to overturn right to work. And because Democrats took House and Senate for the first time in decades. And
Emma, let me interrupt you in that because you raised an issue. What kind of political support did you receive or not receive from local, state, national politicians?
We've received a lot of support from politicians in our area. So we've gotten support in terms of like letters and donations from our city council members. We've had support from our state reps and senators that are in the House and Senate here, and then also in Congress. And so we felt a lot of support. We're very lucky to have support across different levels of politicians and to be in a space and time in Michigan where we have a positive union environment.
Anybody else want to jump in terms of the kind of political support you got from local, state, or federal officials?
Yeah, I mean, at the University of California, having support from electeds was really important throughout the entire campaign. From when we were unionizing student researchers a couple years ago, we had to change the law in the first place in order to unionize student researchers. So, but throughout the campaign, we had a ton of support from a number of electeds in California, but also across the country. There was really useful in putting pressure on the university to, one, recognize student researchers, and then also pressuring them to meet many of our demands. That combined with obviously organizing on the ground was our strategy. Working with electeds, but also organizing on the ground. Combining those is really what helped us so much to win the things that we won in this last strike.
Did you, any of you, run into a strong political opposition? Saying, I'm in the state legislature, what are these people doing? What do they want? Take action against them, etc. That take place, or?
I feel like the main place we're getting political opposition right now is the regents of the University of Michigan, which are statewide elected positions. And I feel like they're right now doing a lot of work to discredit our strike and the necessity of our demands. And so that's, while we feel a lot of support from the city and state politicians and the national politicians, it's the ones that are closest to home that are actually, I think, doing the much damage in terms of supporting our strike and what we deserve, which I think is disappointing because I think they should be the ones who are most aware of our living and working conditions and how much we need these demands.
Anybody else want to jump in terms of political support or opposition at the local, state, or federal level? Okay. We have a question that comes in, which is an interesting and I think in a sense profound question and simple. It says, quote, what does solidarity mean to you as a worker on strike? What is the concept of solidarity? What's that about? Simple but important question. Who wants to take a shot at that one? Raphael, start it off. Solidarity, what does it mean to you?
I mean, I can give you one example of what solidarity was. I mean, it was being out there on the picket line. All of my coworkers from the department going to the picket line day after day, waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning, going to campus, even us living all over LA, coming together every single day on the picket line until late into the evening. That was real solidarity, and the kind of the feeling of being on the picket line with all of your workers, all of your coworkers, 6 weeks later, it's an incredible feeling. It's I don't know, I'm glad the strike is over, but I do kind of miss that feeling of being there on the picket line with your coworkers. I would say that's what solidarity feels like.
Good. Who else wants to jump in on that one?
I can jump in. So solidarity is fake. Like, obviously the person I see on the picket line, whether or not they're a union member, I know that they have my back. But like University of Michigan, I am hundreds of miles away from them, but I know that their fight is our fight. And like everything that they're fighting for is something that I want to fight for our members. And like I hope that they get everything they want. So every strike that is out there, I know may not be a win directly for me or a friend at my campus, but I know it's a fight for us in the future because their wins are something that we can aim for next, and we're just going to build upon each other. So it really means supporting each other, donating, like we try to donate to the strike funds closest to us and whenever we can. But it really means like doing the tiny things of supporting people close and far away, educating members on like what's going on nationwide.
Well, some of you mentioned also that other unions, whether construction unions or service industry unions, were on your picket lines as well. How does that feel to have people from a different walk of life join you and help support your fight? What's that about?
I think that type of solidarity has meant a lot for us, to know that, I think it's a reminder that our fight is more than beyond us, and to have this community and camaraderie, you know, not only amongst ourselves on the picket line or with our students or the other campus workers, but, you know, just other workers in Ann Arbor. And, you know, we do the same for them when the time comes and the situation is reversed, to really support each other and to see that, you know, I think it keeps us going when things continue to get tough. And our union president has a sweatshirt that says like solidarity through collective action is love, which is like kind of cheesy, but it is true. I think that it really is care for each other, you know, both those in your workplace and outside.
Sophie, did you want to jump in on that? Solidarity?
Yeah, I can jump in. So we haven't been on strike yet since we're bargaining for our first contract, but even in this bargaining fight, most recently we're fighting for union shop at the table, and the other unions on MIT's campus wrote a letter in solidarity to MIT indicating that, you know, all other unions at MIT have union shop and they won't accept MIT pushing an open shop at MIT's campus, because a loss or a win for one union is a loss or a win for all of us, right? The more that workers can get, regardless of what union we're in, the more it bolsters the entire labor movement. And we've seen that throughout our bargaining fight. If we can point to other graduate worker contracts that have X, Y, or Z provision, it's a lot easier for us to push for that at the table than if we are pushing for something for the very first time. So yeah, I absolutely agree with the sentiment that everyone has echoed, that, you know, a win for one of us is a win for all of us.
You know, it's interesting, the points that you make. I'm the chairman of a Senate committee called the Health, Education, Labor, and Pension Committee. And one of the issues we are struggling with is a national crisis, as all of you know. Our nation, especially during and after the pandemic, is really looking at many, many mental health problems in America. And there are people who talk about the isolation that many of us in this country feel, the separation that we feel from others, the sense of loneliness that exists. And what I'm hearing from you is actually standing up and bringing people together to fight for a common goal. I mean, obviously it has economic benefits, that's the goal. But in the process, by coming together, call it love, call it whatever you want, you're breaking through your own isolation into working with others, and that feels, from what I'm hearing you say, pretty good. Yep. All right. All right, listen, I think what excites me very much, and all of you have mentioned it, is at a time when we live in a nation of massive income and wealth inequality, richest people doing phenomenally well. We have 60% of our people living paycheck to paycheck. We have hundreds of thousands of people who are homeless. We didn't talk about student debt, which I'm sure is an issue on all of your campuses, right? People struggling with student debt. That in the midst of all of that, what you're seeing from coast to coast are people saying, hey, enough is enough. I live in the richest country in the history of the world. I am entitled to a decent standard of living, whether I am working as a graduate student on a major campus, whether I'm working at Amazon or Starbucks or in some factory someplace. And you're really seeing a significant increase in workers standing up and fighting back. And it really is extraordinary to see that effort among tens of thousands of people on college campuses all across this country. So you are an inspiration to all of us. Thank you all very much for what you're doing. And let's go forward together. And to the viewers, thank you all very much for being with us tonight. Take care. Thank you, panelists.